A 24-year-old German immigrant crouches on a Montana hilltop with a bullet wound in his backside and a single-shot carbine in his hands. His lips are cracked, his canteen is empty, the sun is dropping toward the western ridgeline, and the smell of dead horses is already thickening in the summer heat. 4 miles to the north, 220 of his fellow soldiers are already dead. He doesn't know it yet. In less than 2 hours, an entire battalion of the 7th United States Cavalry was wiped from the face of the earth. Not a single man survived. No wounded crawled away. No messenger broke through. 220 men rode into the rolling hills above the Little Bighorn River, and not one of them rode out. The man who would become the last living witness to the battle that shattered American mythology spent that night listening to the wounded scream for water and wondering if George Armstrong Custer was coming to save them. His name was Charles Windolph. He was a private in Company H. He barely spoke English, and the story he carried for the next 74 years was nothing like the legend America chose to believe. By the end of this video, you'll understand what Charles Windolph saw, what he heard, and why his account, suppressed for decades, changes everything we think we know about Custer's last stand. You'll understand how the most famous cavalry regiment in American history rode into a valley and simply vanished. And you'll understand why the answer, when it finally came 2 days later, was worse than anything the survivors had imagined. That answer starts with a decision made at noon on June 25, 1876, a decision that no one on that hilltop could undo. Charles Windolph would carry this story for 74 more years. He would outlive every other white survivor. And when he finally told the full truth, it was nothing like the legend. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of history's most decisive battles, hit that like button and subscribe. I bring you a new one every week. Now, let me take you back to the Montana Territory. Summer of 1876. The United States was celebrating its centennial year, 100 years of independence. Fireworks and parades were being planned in Philadelphia and New York and Boston, but out on the northern Great Plains, a different kind of reckoning was unfolding. The federal government had issued an ultimatum to the Lakota Sioux and Northern Cheyenne. Report to your assigned reservations by January 31st, 1876, or be declared hostile. The deadline came and went. Thousands ignored it. And by the summer, the largest gathering of Plains Indian warriors in living memory had assembled somewhere in the valleys of southeastern Montana Territory. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were among their leaders, but this was more than a war party. It was a nation in motion, a confederation of bands that had decided collectively that they would not be herded onto reservations without a fight. The United States Army launched a 3-pronged campaign to find and subdue them. One column marched east from Fort Ellis, another pushed north from Fort Fetterman, and a third, under General Alfred Terry, moved west from Fort Abraham Lincoln in Dakota Territory. Riding with Terry's column was the 7th Cavalry Regiment, roughly 600 men under the field command of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. The summer of 1876 was supposed to be a mopping-up operation. The Army expected scattered bands of resistors. What they found was a nation prepared for war. George Armstrong Custer was the kind of officer who inspired either fanatical loyalty or seething resentment, and there was plenty of both in the 7th Cavalry. He had been court-martialed and suspended from duty in 1867 for going absent without leave to visit his wife. Then General Philip Sheridan personally recalled him because the Army needed his aggressiveness. That tells you everything about the man. The institution punished him and then begged him to come back because no one else fought with his reckless, magnetic intensity. But the man whose story would outlast all of theirs wasn't a general or a captain. He was a German private who could barely write his own name in English. Charles Windolph was born on December 9, 1851, in Bergen an der Damm, in the Kingdom of Hanover, then part of the German Confederation. He emigrated to America as a teenager, one of thousands of young German men who crossed the Atlantic with empty pockets and uncertain prospects. He enlisted in the United States Army because it was a path available to immigrants with few options and less English. By 1876, he was a private in Company H of the 7th Cavalry, serving under Captain Benteen. He was 24 years old, young, quiet, and utterly unremarkable in the ranks. Nothing in his service record suggested he would become the regiment's most enduring voice. He was the kind of soldier no one noticed, until the day that noticing was the difference between living and dying. Years later, his memoir, I Fought with Custer, would become one of the most important first-hand accounts of the battle. But in June of 1876, he was just another trooper in a dusty column, riding towards something none of them fully understood. By mid-June, the 7th Cavalry was deep in Montana territory, following a trail that grew wider and fresher with every mile. Lodgepole tracks scarred the earth in parallel grooves. The grass was eaten down to stubble by thousands of ponies. The signs were unmistakable. An enormous body of native warriors was somewhere ahead. The question was not whether the 7th would find them. It was what would happen when they did. The 7th Cavalry, roughly 600 strong, rode in column toward the Little Bighorn. 12 companies of cavalry, plus Crow and Arikara scouts, a pack train of mules carrying reserve ammunition, and a handful of civilians attached to the command. They had been on the trail for days, sleeping in snatches, eating hardtack and salt pork when they ate at all. The horses were wearing down, their ribs beginning to show through dull coats caked with alkaline dust. The troopers carried Springfield Model 1873 carbines, single-shot breech-loading weapons. A well-trained man could fire 8 rounds a minute, but each shot required manually extracting the spent casing and inserting a fresh cartridge. In the heat of sustained combat, copper casings expanded, jammed in the breech, and had to be pried out with a knife or fingernail. Against warriors armed with repeating Winchester and Henry rifles, weapons that could fire 15 rounds without reloading, the Springfield was a liability dressed up as standard issue. Signs of hostiles grew more alarming with every mile. Pro scouts reported a burning teepee in the distance. Indian ponies were spotted being driven along a parallel ridge. The trail the column followed was not the path of a small band. It was the highway of an army. Every mile deeper into Montana, the evidence mounted, and every mile, the 7th Cavalry rode faster. Around noon on June 25th, after crossing the divide between the Rosebud Creek and the Little Bighorn River drainage, Custer made the decision that would define the battle. He divided the regiment into 3 separate commands. Captain Benteen received companies H, D, and K, roughly 125 men. His orders were to scout the bluffs to the south and left, to ensure no warriors escaped in that direction. Benteen, a veteran officer who privately despised Custer, considered the order pointless, a wild goose chase designed to keep him away from the action. Major Marcus Reno received companies M, A, and G, plus the Arikara and Crow scouts, roughly 120 men. His orders were to cross the Little Bighorn River and charge the southern end of the massive native encampment that scouts had located in the valley. Custer himself took the largest force, companies C, E, F, I, and L, approximately 220 men. He would swing north along the bluffs above the river, presumably to strike the village from a second direction and catch the enemy between 2 converging attacks. No written orders were issued. The plan, such as it was, existed only in Custer's mind. The 3 columns separated and rode apart across the broken Montana landscape. They would never reunite. In the history of American military disasters, few decisions are as studied or as damning as this one. Custer divided a force that was already outnumbered against an enemy whose strength he had not bothered to verify. Across terrain he had never scouted. Remember that number, 220. You'll need it later. What happened over the next 4 hours would end careers, end lives, and end the myth of American cavalry invincibility. Windolph rode with Benteen's column. They scouted the hills to the south and found nothing. The bluffs were empty, the ravines dry and silent. Benteen turned his 3 companies back toward the main trail, irritated at having been sent on a fool's errand. Windolph felt the heat pressing down on his shoulders, heard the creak of leather and the rhythmic clank of carbine slings against canteens. Then, faintly, carried on the wind from somewhere to the north and west, he heard it, distant gunfire, rolling across the valley like summer thunder. Something was happening at the river. Benteen's column was now riding back toward the sound of the guns. Ahead, Reno's 120 men had just crossed the Little Bighorn and charged into the largest Native American encampment in the history of the Great Plains. They expected to find women and children fleeing in panic. What they found instead was a wall of warriors and the beginning of the worst afternoon in the history of the United States Cavalry. Reno's men were about to discover what 5-to-1 odds actually looked like. Reno's 120 men splash across the Little Bighorn River around 2 in the afternoon. The water is cold and knee-deep on the horses. On the far bank, they shake out into a textbook skirmish line. Company M anchors the right. A holds the center. G stretches to the left. The Arikara scouts screen forward, probing toward the southern edge of the village. The line advances at a trot, then a gallop. Dust rises in a brown curtain behind them. For the first few hundred yards, it almost works. The formation holds. The horses are running true. The village is ahead, half hidden by cottonwood trees and low brush along the riverbank. Reno can see lodges, he can see movement. Then the warriors appear. Not dozens, not hundreds. An estimated 1,500 to 2,500 fighters pour from the village and from the ravines on the flanks. Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho. Mounted and on foot, armed with rifles, bows, war clubs, and lances. The sheer mass of them is staggering. The sound hits first, a rolling wall of war cries and rifle fire that drowns out the bugles trying to signal commands. The ground itself seems to tremble under the hooves of hundreds of warrior ponies converging from 3 directions at once. Reno's skirmish line staggers. The scouts break first, peeling away toward the flanks and melting into the timber. The left side of the line begins to buckle as warriors swing wide around the flank. Reno, watching his command about to be enveloped, makes a critical decision. He halts the charge after advancing only about half a mile and orders a retreat to a cottonwood grove near the riverbank. This was not a battle. Not yet. This was 120 men realizing in the space of a heartbeat that they had ridden into a trap they could not fight their way out of. But the retreat to the timber was only the beginning of the disaster. The cottonwood grove offers no real protection. The trees are scattered, the undergrowth thin. Warriors infiltrate from all sides, closing to point-blank range. Horses, wild with terror, stampede through the defensive line, and with them go saddlebags packed with ammunition. Men who moments ago carried 100 rounds find themselves down to what remains in their belts and cartridge loops. Reno orders a retreat to the bluffs across the river. What follows is not an orderly withdrawal. It is a rout. Men scramble for their horses. Some mount and spur for the river at a dead gallop. Others are on foot, running through waist-high brush while warriors close at full speed on every side. The river crossing becomes a killing ground. Troopers plunge into chest-deep water, fighting the current while bullets and arrows tear into them from the banks above. The Little Bighorn runs red-brown with churned mud and blood. Men clutch at stirrups, at horsetails, at anything that might drag them across. Some never reach the far bank. Their bodies tumble downstream in the current. On the far side, the survivors claw up the bluffs, steep, crumbling slopes of clay and loose gravel fully exposed to fire from below. They reach the top, gasping, bleeding, wild-eyed. Officers scream for men to form a perimeter. There is no perimeter. There are clumps of terrified soldiers trying to find cover in shallow depressions on a barren hilltop, with no water and no shade. In less than 90 minutes, Reno's command had gone from a parade ground charge to a shattered, leaderless mob on a hilltop, with dwindling ammunition and no idea where Custer was. Benteen's column, returning from the fruitless scout to the south, arrives at the bluffs around 4 in the afternoon to find chaos. Wounded men lie scattered across the hilltop. Reno is dazed, his face spattered with the blood and brains of a scout who had been shot right beside him during the retreat. There is no coherent command structure. Officers argue, enlisted men stare blankly at the valley below. Windolph sees it through the eyes of a man riding into someone else's catastrophe. The men on the hilltop are hollow-faced. Some are openly weeping. The wounded moan in the afternoon heat, calling for water that does not exist on this barren crown of earth. From the valley below, the Lakota and Cheyenne warriors saw something the soldiers on the hilltop could not: the full scale of their own encampment. Thousands of lodges stretched along the river for 3 miles. This was not a raiding party that had been cornered. This was a nation that had chosen its ground. Benteen takes effective command. He begins organizing a defensive perimeter, ordering men to drag saddles, packs, and the carcasses of dead horses into a rough, oval breastwork around the hilltop. The pack train arrives, straggling in with mules carrying reserve ammunition. It is a lifeline. But the mules are panicked and scattered, and distributing cartridges to companies that are intermixed and disorganized takes time the hilltop does not have. The hilltop was holding. Barely. But something was wrong. Something no one wanted to say out loud. It had been hours since anyone had heard from Custer. No messenger had arrived. No bugle calls echoed from the north. No dust cloud of approaching cavalry appeared on the horizon. Just silence from that direction, and the distant rolling sound of gunfire that had stopped as suddenly as it had begun. That silence was the most terrifying sound Charles Windolph had ever heard. The hilltop defense takes shape in the late afternoon light. Roughly 310 men, the combined remnants of Reno's shattered command and Benteen's 3 companies, form a rough oval perimeter on the bluffs above the Little Bighorn. 7 men are already too badly wounded to fight. Ammunition from the pack mules is distributed, but not evenly. Some sections of the line have cartridges stacked in neat rows beside their rifle pits. Others are scraping rounds from the belts of the dead. Windolph lies in Company H's section of the perimeter, pressed behind the swelling carcass of a dead horse, his Springfield leveled across the animal's ribs. Warriors probe from all directions, darting in on horseback or on foot, snapping off shots, pulling back before the soldiers can respond with concentrated fire. It is not a full assault, not yet. It is testing, probing for weakness. The smell is what Windolph would remember most. Bloating horseflesh and black powder smoke mixing with the sage and dust of the Montana prairie, it coated the back of his throat and never quite left. Hours crawl, the sun hangs. Every minute, without word from the commander who had ridden north, is another minute of dread. A group of warriors makes a sudden rush at the southern edge of the perimeter, surging up the slope with a roar. Benteen, steady as ever, walks upright along the line of prone soldiers, pointing out targets, rallying men by name, his voice carrying over the gunfire without a trace of panic. He does not duck. He does not flinch. Windolph watches him and thinks that man is either the bravest officer in the army or the most reckless. The rush is beaten back with a concentrated volley that drops the leading warriors and sends the rest scattering into the ravines. 310 men, on a hilltop with no water, no word from their commander, and a force of warriors below them that outnumbered them perhaps 8-1. And the sun was still up. Then Captain Weir did something no one expected. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, Captain Thomas Weir of Company D cannot stand the inaction. Without clear authorization, he leads his company north along the ridge of bluffs, trying to push toward where Custer's 5 troops had ridden hours before. Other companies follow in partial support, extending the perimeter northward in a ragged line. They reach a high point, later called Weir's Point, about a mile north of the main defensive position. What Weir sees stops him cold. To the north, 3 to 4 miles away, the terrain is alive with movement. Dust, smoke, shapes on the ridgeline, figures on horseback, but they are not cavalry. There are no guidons snapping in the wind, no formations, no blue columns, just warriors moving across distant hills in loose masses. And on the ground between, scattered across the slopes and draws, shapes that might be men lying still, or might be nothing. The distance is too great to tell. But then the warriors turned toward Weir, hundreds of them, peeling away from whatever they had been doing to the north, and riding hard for the exposed company on the point. The probe was over. The full weight of the overwhelming force that had already broken Reno was shifting south, and Weir's company was directly in its path. Weir's men are driven back to the main perimeter in a fighting retreat that nearly becomes a second rout. They reach the hilltop just ahead of the pursuing warriors, and the entire defensive oval contracts, tightens, hunkers down. Men dig rifle pits with knives, tin cups, bare fingernails scraping out shallow depressions in the hard Montana earth. For the Lakota and Cheyenne, this was not desperation. It was strategy. The hilltop soldiers were pinned and going nowhere. The greater victory had already been won to the north against the column they called Long-Hair's soldiers. Now the warriors could choose their pace. Some prepared for a dawn assault when the soldiers would be weakened by thirst and exhaustion. Others tended their own wounded, mourned their own dead. The village was not a disorganized mob. It was a coordinated military force that had chosen when and where to fight, and it had won. Night falls. There is no full assault. Instead, there is something worse: darkness, thirst, and the sound of the wounded. Windolph lies in his shallow rifle pit, unable to stretch his legs without exposing himself to fire. The wound in his buttock throbs with every heartbeat, a deep, grinding ache that runs down his leg. Around him, wounded men cry for water. There is none. The nearest water is the river at the base of the bluffs, 200 feet below through ground that crawls with warriors. No one is going down there in the dark. We still had heard no word from Custer. We began to suspicion that some terrible fate might have overtaken him. What it was we could only guess, not lucky Custer and those 5 gallant troops who rode with him. The phrase, "Lucky Custer," lands like a stone dropped into still water. Everyone on that hilltop knew the nickname. Everyone had heard it used with envy and admiration for years, and now every man was thinking the same thing. No one wanted to say it. The silence from the north was not a mystery anymore. It was an answer, and every man on that hilltop felt it in his gut. Imagine standing on that barren hill as darkness falls. No water, no relief column. The wounded gasping in the black. And to the north, where 220 of your comrades rode hours ago, nothing. Absolute nothing. When the sun came up on June 26th, Charles Windolph would earn his place in history, not with a charge, but with a canteen. Dawn, June 26. The warriors resume firing with the first grey light, and the hilltop becomes a killing ground of slow attrition. Men are picked off, one, by sharpshooters concealed in the ravines below, warriors who have crept into position during the night, and now fire with patient, methodical accuracy. But the greatest enemy is no longer bullets. It is thirst. Tongues are swelling, lips split and bleed. The wounded are delirious, clawing at the dirt, begging for water that no one has. A decision is made. Someone has to get to the river. Volunteers are called for. The mission is simple and suicidal. Slide down the exposed bluff to the river with canteens and kettles, fill them under direct fire, and climb back up. Every foot of the route is visible to the warriors in the ravines. Windolph volunteers, not to carry water, but to cover the carriers. He and a small group of sharpshooters, including Sergeant Benjamin Paul, the man they called Crazy Jim Severs, Dan Newell, and Slaper, take up firing positions where they can lay suppressive fire into the ravines, while the water carriers make their desperate runs. The carriers go in pairs, sliding on their bellies down the crumbling bluff face, canteens clanking against the rocks. Each trip takes an eternity. A man named Peter Thompson is among them, filling kettles at the river's edge, while bullets kick up spouts of water inches from his hands. He fills one kettle, then another, crouching in the shallows with his back to the bluff and his face to the enemy. Windolph fires methodically from above. Aim. Fire. Extract the casing. Reload. Those single-shot Springfields demand perfect discipline. Every miss is a lifetime of vulnerability, while the breech is opened and a fresh cartridge seated. He finds a rhythm. Pick a target, wait for movement in the brush. Squeeze. The warriors in the nearest ravine learn to respect the position. Their fire slackens, shifts to other sectors. The carriers scramble back up with water sloshing from the kettles. Charles Windolph was not a hero from a novel. He was a 24-year-old immigrant with a bullet wound in his backside and dirt caked into the creases of his knuckles. He did not think about glory. He thought about the next cartridge, and the next, and the next. For courageously holding a position that secured water for the command, Windolph and 3 of his comrades would later receive the Medal of Honor. The citation specifically notes his role as a sharpshooter covering the water carriers on June 26, 1876. Benteen, witnessing the action, promotes the young German immigrant to sergeant on the spot, a battlefield promotion earned not with a saber, but with a canteen and a carbine. The water reaches the wounded. Men weep. Some are too far gone to drink, their throats so swollen they choke on the first mouthful. But the hilltop holds. In the great mythology of the American West, the Battle of the Little Bighorn belongs to Custer, but on that hilltop, on the morning of June 26th, it belonged to the men who crawled down a bluff for a kettle of water, bought with blood. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the warriors disappeared. In the early afternoon of June 26th, the firing slackens, then stops entirely. The hilltop soldiers peer over their breastworks in disbelief as the massive encampment below begins to move. Thousands of people, horses, travers, dogs, streams of humanity flowing south up the valley in a column that stretches for miles. The village is leaving, but no one on the hilltop celebrated, because the question that had haunted them all night and all morning was still unanswered. Where was Custer? Where were those 220 souls that the hilltop never saw again? Some men speculate that Custer has linked up with General Terry's column and is pursuing the village from the north. Others say nothing at all. They have heard the silence from that direction for over 24 hours. They tend their wounds. They drink the water that was carried up the bluff at the cost of blood and courage. They do not advance. They do not know what lies ahead. 300 exhausted men sat on a hilltop in the Montana sun and watched their enemy walk away. They should have felt relief. Instead, they felt dread. The answer came the next morning, and it was worse than any of them had imagined. On June 27th, the advance scouts of General Terry's relief column reach the hilltop. The siege is over. But the soldiers who arrive bring no celebration, only urgent questions and grim faces. They push north along the bluffs to find Custer. What they find, 4 miles from the hilltop, ends all speculation. Bodies, scattered across the ridges and ravines in clusters, some in what might have been defensive positions, behind dead horses, others where they fell running, stripped of uniforms and equipment, treated in the manner of fallen enemies according to Plains warrior tradition, in ways that left the burial details shaken and silent. 210 men of the 7th Cavalry, including George Armstrong Custer himself, dead where they fought. Not a single survivor. The horses, too, are dead, shot to form barricades that did not hold. The June heat had already begun its work. The smell reached the scouts before the sight did. Swollen, darkened forms in remnants of blue wool, many beyond recognition. Custer himself was identified only by his build and his short cropped hair. He had cut his famous long locks before the campaign. The age of Lucky Custer ended on a nameless ridge in Montana, and the men who had waited for his rescue now understood that he had needed theirs. The full count, was staggering. The 5 companies that had ridden north, C, E, F, I, and L, numbering approximately 220 men, were annihilated. 0 survivors. Not one. It was the worst defeat of the United States Army by native forces in American history. On the hilltop, the toll was severe but survivable. Approximately 50 men killed and wounded out of the 310 who had held the perimeter across those 2 brutal days. The combined losses of the 7th Cavalry, including the dead from Reno's Valley fight and retreat, exceeded 260. The bodies on the field told a story of rapid disintegration. Some companies appeared to have held briefly in organized clusters. Others were scattered across hundreds of yards in patterns that spoke of flight. Historians would debate for more than a century whether the end came in minutes or stretched across an agonizing hour. But the physical evidence pointed to panic, fragmentation, and overwhelming force converging from every direction at once. In the centennial year of American independence, 1876, a summer of parades and fireworks, the nation's most celebrated cavalry regiment was destroyed in an afternoon. The news would reach the East Coast during 4th of July celebrations, slamming into the festivities like a fist through glass. No wounded, no prisoners, no last messages scrawled in the dirt. Just silence, the same silence that had haunted the hilltop for 2 days. Windolph and the survivors on the bluffs were in no condition to walk the field themselves. But the news reached them in waves, carried by Terry's officers and scouts who returned with ashen faces and few words. Each report was worse than the last, every company accounted for, every man found dead. Windolph later wrote about this moment with a restraint that is more devastating than any outburst could have been. The men of the hilltop had spent 2 days hoping, praying that Custer would appear on the horizon, with those 5 companies riding in column, guidons flying to break the siege and scatter the warriors. They had prayed for rescue. Now they learned that the men they were waiting for had needed rescuing more, and there had been no one to come. Think about what that silence meant. For 48 hours, every man on that hilltop believed rescue was possible. Every hour of thirst, every bullet that cracked overhead, was endured in the faith that Custer's 220 were fighting their way toward them. And now they knew that the distant gunfire they heard on the afternoon of June 25th, the gunfire that stopped so abruptly, was the sound of those men dying. Windolph's wound, the one in his buttock that he had fought through for 2 days, would eventually earn him the Purple Heart, when that medal was retroactively authorized decades later. He returned to duty within weeks. In his memoir, he barely mentions the wound, as though embarrassed by its location more than its severity. But the scar was real, and so was the infection he fought off without proper medical care on the long march back to the Yellowstone River. The dead on the field were buried where they fell, in shallow graves scraped from the Montana hardpan with whatever tools were available. Many graves were so shallow that bones surfaced within months, exposed by rain and wind and scavenging animals. The battlefield would be revisited in 1877, 1879, and 1881, each expedition finding remains that the earth had refused to keep. Marble markers would eventually replace the crude wooden stakes, turning a killing ground into a national cemetery that still stands today. Cheyenne oral histories from the battle describe women and children in the village, hearing the fighting as rolling thunder carried on the wind. When the guns fell silent, families moved among the fallen soldiers, gathering weapons and ammunition. Some warriors recognized individual troopers they had engaged at close quarters. For the Lakota and Cheyenne, this was not a massacre. It was a defensive victory. They had been attacked in their homes by soldiers who rode into the heart of their encampment. They had fought back. They had won. And they knew, with the certainty of long experience, that the army would return in force to punish them for winning. The news traveled by scout and telegraph, crossing the plains and then the wires. It reached the East Coast in early July, arriving in newspaper offices like a thunderclap. Headlines screamed of massacre and demanded vengeance. The nation's centennial celebration was poisoned by rage and grief. Within months, the army launched massive retaliatory campaigns that would ultimately break the power of the Lakota and Cheyenne nations and force them onto reservations for good. The great victory at the Little Bighorn became, paradoxically, the beginning of the end for the people who won it. The Lakota and Cheyenne won the battle. The United States won the war. And between those two facts lies one of the cruelest ironies in American history. But for Charles Windolph, the battle never really ended. In the decades after 1876, the Battle of the Little Bighorn was mythologized beyond recognition. Custer became a martyred hero in paintings, poems, and dime novels. The golden-haired cavalier who died bravely surrounded by his men, pistol in hand, saber at his side. The reality, a botched reconnaissance, a fragmented command, a leader who divided his forces against an enemy he had fatally underestimated, was buried as deeply as the bodies on the field. Meanwhile, the men who actually survived, the ones who held the hilltop, who carried water under fire, who lay in rifle pits through the longest night of their lives, were largely forgotten. The public wanted the legend of the last stand, not the grim truth of the defense that kept 310 men alive. History pivoted on a decision made at noon, but the legend was built on the myth of the man who made it. Windolph watched this happen. For 74 years, he watched the nation worship the man who led 220 soldiers to their deaths, while ignoring the men who kept the rest alive. He was discharged from the army in 1883 as First Sergeant of Company H. The battlefield promotion Benteen gave him on that smoke-choked hilltop had stuck. He settled in the Black Hills of South Dakota, married, and lived a life so quiet it could have belonged to any retired soldier in any small town in America. One by one, the other survivors died. The ranks thinned with each passing year, then each passing decade. By the 1930s, Windolph was the last living white veteran of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Journalists sought him out. They found a lean old man with steady eyes, who told his story with the same measured, understated tone that marks every page of his memoir. No bravado, no embellishment. Just the facts of what he saw and what he did. He died on March 11th, 1950, at the age of 1980. He is buried at Black Hills National Cemetery. The Medal of Honor winner, the water carrier's protector, the last man who could say, from first-hand experience, "I was there." A 24-year-old German immigrant on a Montana hilltop, a bullet wound, a single-shot carbine, 4 miles away, 220 men already dead. Now you know what Charles Windolph knew, and what he didn't. He didn't know that Custer was dead. He didn't know that the gunfire had stopped because there was no one left to fire. He knew only that the sun was going down, the wounded were screaming for water, and someone had to hold the line until morning. So he did. The Battle of the Little Bighorn belongs to Custer in the history books, but it survived in living memory, told by a living voice, because of the men who held a hilltop and refused to die. If this story moved you, subscribe. There are more untold battles waiting.